Back in 2018, during his presidency, Donald Trump made headlines with a controversial statement about immigration. When asked about immigrants from Africa, he reportedly responded, "Why would the US want immigrants from all these shithole countries?" It wasn't subtle, and it left no doubt about how he viewed the continent at the time. Fast forward a few years, and something unexpected is happening. Trump, the same man who dismissed Africa in such stark terms, suddenly seems very interested in the continent. It's a surprising turn of events, leaving many wondering, what's behind this newfound attention? According to renowned African thinker Professor PLO Lumumba, the answer is clear. Africa is no longer seen as a charity case. It's now a global prize. For decades, the United States enjoyed unrivaled dominance on the world stage, wielding the strongest economy and military to spread its influence. During this time, Africa was largely sidelined, dismissed as insignificant or simply a recipient of aid. But things are changing. The unchallenged global dominance of the US is beginning to slip as new power players, like China and Russia, step onto the scene. These nations aren't just rising in influence, they're actively working to disrupt US supremacy, and they've set their sights on Africa as a key battleground in this geopolitical struggle. Why Africa? The continent is rich in natural resources, from minerals critical to modern technology to vast agricultural potential. It's also home to a young and rapidly growing population, offering opportunities for markets, innovation, and partnerships. Recognizing this, countries like China, Russia, Turkey, and Iran are making moves to deepen their footholds in Africa. Infrastructure projects, military alliances, trade agreements. Everyone seems to want a slice of the action. And the US? It's watching closely, realizing it can't afford to be left behind. Lumumba predicts that if Trump secures another term in office, we'll see America shift its strategy to focus on Africa like never before. The big question, though, is how Trump plans to approach this new competition. What will his playbook look like in this high-stakes scramble for Africa? If you are still watching this video, it means you love it. Why not take out a second and hit that like button? Have you done that? Let us continue. It's no secret that Trump isn't exactly a fan of foreign aid. During his previous term, his administration consistently pushed to slash international assistance programs driven by the America First mantra. That approach left little room for handouts, and many believe his return to power would see an even tougher stance on cutting aid globally. But here's where things get interesting. According to Professor PLO Lumumba, Trump might need to rethink that strategy, especially when it comes to Africa. The dynamics on the continent have shifted dramatically, and it's no longer the unchallenged playing field the West once dominated. China has taken center stage with massive infrastructure projects under its Belt and Road Initiative, building roads, ports, and railways that connect African nations. Russia, meanwhile, has stepped in as a key security ally, forging military partnerships across the continent, particularly in the Sahel. And they're not alone. Turkey, Iran, and even South Korea are strengthening their ties with African nations, offering alternatives that didn't exist before. At the same time, the influence of traditional powers like France and the US is fading. Anti-French sentiment has swept across West Africa, leading to the expulsion of French military forces from several countries. Even the US hasn't been immune to this shift, with its military presence reduced in places like Nigeria and Chad. These developments haven't gone unnoticed in Washington, and Trump knows that if the US doesn't act fast, it risks losing its foothold entirely. But according to Lumumba, Trump's renewed interest in Africa isn't driven by a sudden wave of goodwill. It's a move born out of necessity. He's not coming to build partnerships or strengthen friendships. His approach will likely be a sharp pivot, aimed squarely at securing American interests. Forget handshakes and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. This is about hard-nosed strategy. Unlike his predecessors, Trump is expected to play a more aggressive game. Analysts predict he'll focus on cementing US control over key military bases, tapping into Africa's vast mineral resources, and securing vital trade routes, all before rivals like China and Russia solidify their influence. While the US has watched China build infrastructure and Russia position itself as a go-to security partner, it's largely stayed on the sidelines. Lumumba suggests that Trump's presidency could mark a turning point, a last-ditch effort to reassert American dominance in Africa. Here's where it gets even more intriguing. Trump's motives may not be entirely about countering China. Some analysts speculate he could also be positioning himself to cozy up to an old acquaintance, Russian President Vladimir Putin. Despite the official US stance that views Russia as a threat, Trump has consistently acted as if he doesn't share that perspective. In fact, many believe his relationship with Putin runs far deeper than he lets on. According to Professor Lumumba, Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin could create a strange and unsettling partnership in Africa. But here's the real question. Is Africa prepared for yet another round of global power plays on its soil? It's been over 140 years since the Berlin Conference, where European powers carved up the African continent like a pie, claiming its resources for themselves. While colonization in its traditional sense may be a thing of the past, the essence of that exploitation hasn't gone anywhere. Instead of flags and armies, today's superpowers use promises and summits to get what they want. These modern Africa Plus One summits have become the new Berlin Conference, with world powers vying for influence. And frustratingly, African leaders flock to them in droves, eager to attend, even though history has shown that the scales in these meetings are rarely balanced. Take China's recent forum on China-Africa cooperation in Beijing, for example. President Xi Jinping announced plans to pump nearly $51 billion into Africa over 3 years, pledged to prioritize Africa in a renewable energy revolution, and promised to create 1 million jobs for Africa's youth. On top of that, he offered military aid, including $141 million in grants and training programs for thousands of African security personnel. South Korea wasn't far behind. At the Korea-Africa Summit, President Yoon Suk-yeol promised $14 billion in export loans and pledged to boost cooperation in critical minerals and technology. Even Italy got in on the action, holding its own summit earlier this year, with its Prime Minister unveiling a $5.5 billion plan for African development. And at every one of these events, African heads of state showed up in full force. On the surface, it looks like these nations are extending a helping hand, but when you dig deeper, it's clear who benefits the most. Studies have shown that these summits are inherently lopsided. Paul Nantulia, a researcher at the African Center for Strategic Studies, argues that the host nations hold all the cards. They drive the negotiations, leaving African leaders with little leverage. In the end, Africa's resources are sold off for deals that barely scratch the surface of their true value. Why do you think these countries are so eager to host Africa-centric summits? Why is Africa such a critical part of their foreign policies? The answer lies in the future. The Fourth Industrial Revolution, sometimes called the Great Reset, is reshaping the global economy. And the technologies driving this revolution rely heavily on critical minerals like cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements, most of which are found in Africa. Africa isn't just a player in this game, it's the prize. The countries with access to these resources will hold the keys to the global economy for decades to come. That's why every major power, from China and Russia to the West, is scrambling to form alliances and deepen ties with African nations. It's eerily reminiscent of the Berlin Conference, but with a twist. Instead of outright colonization, today's powers are wrapping their ambitions in the language of partnership and mutual benefit. Decolonization may have put an end to formal divisions, but the tug-of-war for Africa's resources continues, only now under a more polished guise. African leaders are being asked to partner in ways that often serve foreign interests far more than their own. It's frustrating to watch how these so-called Africa summits unfold. Every time, it's the same routine. A foreign country announces a grand meeting with African leaders, and before you know it, heads of state from across the continent are packing their bags. They drop everything, fly halfway around the world, and sit through scripted sessions that feel more like a school assembly than serious negotiations. Take a closer look at where these summits are held. The US-Africa Summit hosted in Washington, D.C. The Korea-Africa Summit, held in Seoul. The Italy-Africa Summit, of course it took place in Rome. Each time, it's the same pattern. African leaders travel to the host nation, sit through a tightly scheduled program, and, let's not forget, line up for a big group photo at the end, just like kids at a class trip. It's embarrassing, as Kenyan President William Ruto once pointed out. What's even more frustrating is that Africa is a continent with immense resources, yet its leaders often approach these summits as if they're the ones begging for favors. Think about it. Why can't the African Union send a few well-prepared representatives to negotiate on behalf of the continent? Why do all these leaders need to show up in person, giving the impression of submission instead of partnership? And more importantly, what do these summits actually achieve? Let's look at the promises. Host nations often announce eye-popping numbers to dazzle the audience. $10 billion in development aid here, $5 billion in infrastructure investment there. South Korea promised billions in loans and aid at its summit. Italy pledged billions for African development. On paper, it sounds great until you dig deeper. Reports show that many of these promises remain unfulfilled. The money rarely arrives, but the resources, Africa delivers every time. These summits aren't acts of goodwill. They're strategic moves by powerful nations to secure their interests. China, for instance, wants easy access to Africa's vast mineral wealth and its growing consumer markets. The US is eyeing the same resources, but with an added goal, blocking China and Russia from gaining too much influence on the continent. Europe, meanwhile, wants to tap into Africa's resources while also curbing migration. That's why many European policies tie aid and investment to controlling migration flows. In the end, every country hosting these summits is focused on what they can get. They may offer loans, infrastructure projects, or some financial aid, but their primary goal is access to minerals, markets, and strategic influence. Africa, however, often ends up on the losing side of these deals. The continent provides its natural resources, but the promised benefits either don't materialize or come with strings attached. And let's be honest, the host countries aren't interested in Africa's development. They're interested in what Africa can do for them. African leaders often seem unaware of the leverage they hold and continue to sign agreements that barely benefit their countries. Why does this keep happening? It's time for a new way of thinking, one that puts Africa's immense potential at the forefront. Africa is rich, not just in resources like gold, cobalt, and lithium, but also in people. With a growing population full of young, innovative minds, the continent has everything it needs to chart its own future. But to unlock that future, African leaders must recognize the power they hold. They're not in a position to beg, they're in a position to negotiate. The world needs Africa, and that gives the continent the upper hand, if only its leaders would seize it. One way to start is by rethinking how Africa engages with the rest of the world. Instead of individual countries striking separate deals, why not create a unified front? Imagine if the African Union, AU, had a dedicated High Commissioner for External Partnerships. This team, made up of representatives from a handful of member states, could negotiate on behalf of the entire continent, ensuring that Africa's collective interests are prioritized. The lack of unity among African nations is one of the biggest challenges. Each country has its own needs, and that makes it easy for powerful nations to divide and conquer. Instead of competing against one another, African countries should focus on shared goals, like industrialization and technological development. Why keep signing deals that send raw minerals abroad when those same minerals could fuel Africa's own industries? Take critical minerals like cobalt and lithium, which are essential for making batteries. South Korea, for example, is investing heavily in its battery industry using African resources. But why aren't African countries building their own factories to produce batteries right at home? Why not negotiate deals that require foreign companies to create jobs, transfer technology, and drive innovation in Africa? It's time to flip the script. Thankfully, change is already underway. Over the past few years, a wave of new leaders has emerged, shaking up the status quo. These leaders didn't come through traditional elections. They rose to power during coups in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Unlike past military takeovers, these transitions have been largely peaceful and have brought leaders who are determined to prioritize Africa's interests. Dr. Akana Chi-Hombori Kwal, a geopolitical expert from Zimbabwe, called these coups a revolution, a wake-up call for Africa's leadership. Even Western observers have taken notice. During a US congressional meeting, a military general described the leaders of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso as sophisticated, acknowledging their intelligence and strategic thinking. And their actions speak volumes. Within a short time, these leaders have made bold moves that many thought impossible. They've kicked out French forces and ended colonial-era agreements that gave France control over key resources in Francophone Africa. They've taken back control of their natural wealth, nationalizing resources to benefit their own people rather than foreign corporations. Take a moment to picture this. Burkina Faso, a country that has long been exploited for its resources, finally taking control of its most valuable asset, gold. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, things are changing fast. For starters, Traoré has halted the export of unprocessed gold to Western nations. Why? Because for years, raw gold was sold at rock-bottom prices, leaving the country with crumbs while others reaped the profits. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Traoré has spearheaded the creation of Burkina Faso's very first gold refinery. This means the country will no longer just hand over its gold in its raw state. It will refine it, adding tremendous value before it even leaves the borders. For the first time, Burkina Faso is stepping into the driver's seat of its gold industry, ensuring that its people benefit from this lucrative resource. And Burkina Faso isn't alone. Mali is making similar moves. The country recently inked a deal with Russia to build its own gold refinery. For decades, no so-called democratic leader in these nations thought to do something so obvious. Why would they? when it was easier to let foreign powers control everything. Leaders like these were celebrated by the West, not because they brought prosperity to their countries, but because they kept the system of exploitation running smoothly. Now, the game has changed. Leaders in these nations are showing they're ready to fight for their country's true independence, even if it means challenging Western dominance. And they're not doing it alone. They're forming partnerships with countries like Russia and China, nations that approach Africa with a focus on mutual benefit, not control. Take Niger, for example. This country just made history by becoming the first African nation to expel the United States military. For years, American troops were stationed in Niger, supposedly to improve security. But nothing changed. In fact, the situation only worsened. The people saw no real benefit from the US presence, and the new military government decided enough was enough. Against all odds, Niger stood firm and told the US to pack up and leave. Niger's bold move has inspired others. Chad, long considered a strong ally of both France and the US, is now rethinking its agreements. Chad has even threatened to end the status of forces agreement that allows US troops to operate in the country. Whether the US leaves Chad or renegotiates for fairer terms, one thing is clear. African nations are no longer content to play by the old rules. And it's not just the Sahel that's waking up. Look at South Africa, a country unafraid to stand up to global powers. Recently, it took the extraordinary step of accusing Israel, a key US ally, of genocide in court. This isn't just a legal battle. It's a declaration that South Africa won't back down, even in the face of threats or pressure from the United States. The winds of change are sweeping across the continent. What we're seeing isn't just a few isolated decisions, it's the start of a revolution. For centuries, Western Europe and other global powers have benefited from keeping Africa poor and dependent, but that era is coming to an end. Countries across Africa are beginning to assert themselves, demanding fairness, sovereignty, and respect. It's now up to the rest of the continent to follow this example. African nations must unite, stand strong, and push this movement forward. Africa's resources, future, and dignity belong to Africans, not to those who've sought to exploit it for far too long. What are your thoughts on all this? We would love to hear what you think in the comments section. Until then, see you in our next video.